He was a man who could defeat many enemies with just one blow to the ground, causing it to open up and swallow those who wished him harm. He was the Fist King, a title given to the man who had subjugated the Jianghu with his fists alone. He was a man who was known by his title more than by his name. This great warrior was called Dan Wusen. He won great achievements and glory for his name. His name was known in many lands and caused not only respect but also fear. The last hours had been very restless for him. He looked around carefully and was slightly agitated by what he saw. His hands were very sore from the many wounds and scratches. The dirt and blood of his enemies stained his palms. He was ambushed by a mysterious group in the woods. He didn't know who his attackers were, but he knew he had to teach them some respect. He should have dealt with the rest of that group and also tried to find out what they wanted from him. He looked down at the two men standing among their fallen comrades looking at their target. The guy smiled smugly and looked at Dan Wusen, while the other one standing nearby covered his face with a fan but was still just as calm. They were the only two left from the mysterious group and looked quite skilled. Dan Wusen was curious to know where they were from, but this was no ordinary curiosity. He needed to know where his enemies were concentrated. Dan Wusen walked towards them and shouted at them to let him bring back their subordinate. But as soon as this man reached them, he cried out with a plea for mercy. He cried out to the sword demon begging him to help, but the warrior cut him into pieces with a sharp movement. He himself brought him death instead of help. Dan Wusen watched this with caution. It was a great surprise to him because usually they took care of their people. This same warrior cut his own ally without a second thought. Dan Wusen did not approve of people fighting very dirty. Dan Wusen looked at this warrior carefully. He saw madness and cruelty in his eyes. Also visible on his sword was a small plaque with a word written on it. This symbol on his sword seemed very familiar to Dan Wusen, and also the kind of cruelty that the warrior possessed was not inherent to everyone. Dan Wusen put these details together and realized that these two were from the demonic faction and shouted out this, making sure once and for all. The warrior climbed up to the ledge next to Dan Wusen, expressing that he was very impressed with the King of Fists. The fact that the King of Fists had lasted so long in the warrior's opinion justified such a title, and he said so, but Dan Wusen ordered him to be silent. Dan Wusen was not happy at all about being attacked by the demonic faction. Once he realized where the attackers were from, anger filled him, and he noted that he would kill the warrior in just 10 blows. The warrior preparing for battle drew his sword and noted that it was very impudent of Dan Wusen to make such statements. The warrior rushed into the attack, saying that he would very much like to see if the King of Fists would keep his promise. The blow was very strong, but the King of Fists was able to dodge it a little and received almost no damage. This blow instilled fury into his soul, and he rushed at his enemy with greater force in his fists. The blow hit the warrior so quickly that he was a little taken aback, feeling pain because he did not have time to track the movements of the King of Fists. The warrior from the demonic faction did not expect his opponent to be so fast, and he did not like this fact. After his strike, Dan Wusen pointed out that the first strike had just happened and there were only 9 left. Dan Wusen immediately struck again, still counting. The warrior was still holding on, although even after the first strike he was not feeling well. Then Dan Wusen counted 4 more blows, from which the warrior of the demonic faction lost contact with his mind from the unbearable pain throughout his body. But still the warrior held on, and Dan Wusen found it very strange that all his attacks missed the enemy's weak points. He had the feeling that someone was forcibly holding him back, not allowing him to unleash all his power. Before the final promised strike, Dan Wusen discovered that another warrior of the demonic faction who had been standing to the side the entire time had suddenly appeared on a ledge of rock even higher up, manipulating the magic threads. This was unexpected for the King of Fists, and he realized that he was at a great disadvantage when the warrior grabbed his hands with his strong threads. The warrior of the demonic faction watched the King of Fists with a grin, realizing that he had managed to catch him, the goal he had been pursuing for a very long time. The current circumstances made the King of Fists even more angry. He was seething with rage because he had forgotten about the second opponent. The warrior of the demonic faction gripped the hilt of the sword more firmly and pulled it back a little without making a wide swing. The other warrior held Dan Wusen tightly with threads, and the warrior, gathering his last strength, pushed his sword forward and plunged it into the chest of the King of Fists. Dan Wusen's mouth began to bleed due to severe internal injuries. He clutched his wound, not fully understanding what had happened due to the pain shock. The warrior of the demonic faction, without even looking at him, said out of helplessness that this was the end of the reign of the King of Fists. He thought he was the winner until he saw that the King of Fists was not going to stop there. Despite his serious injury, the King of Fists wanted to fulfill his promise and deliver the 10th and final blow. The warrior understood that he would not have time to dodge because he was so beaten that he could hardly speak. The only thing he managed to do was curse. Then there was a strong impact. Dust and stones rose into the air, creating an impenetrable cloud around. The dust soon settled. Heavy, short-winded breathing could be heard. The warrior of the demonic faction had a shallow scratch on his face, but he survived. Looking at the Fist King, who was having difficulty breathing and no longer giving any signals, the demonic faction warrior smiled contentedly. He said with a laugh that the King of Fists really turned out to be very good in battle. His short-haired partner noted that it could be very dangerous, to which he hinted who was to blame. The warrior of the demonic faction poked his finger at the King of Fists several times and noted that if he was going to die, it was not yet time. She wanted to say something else, but then she received a strong punch to the jaw from below. It was foolish for a warrior of the demonic faction to test such carelessness and be sure that the King of Fists would give up so easily. Wusen smiled after the blow and said that, as he promised, he made 10 blows. Wusen, looking at these two, knew that it was the end of his life as the King of Fists. He assumed that he would no longer be able to resist. It was hard for him to realize this because he had gone through a very difficult and long path and was respected by many. Closing his eyes for the last time, he thought that he really wanted to hit this warrior of the demonic faction one more time. It was in this way that Wusen, nicknamed the King of Fists, died at the hands of the demonic faction. Meanwhile, the crow returned to the estate on Mount Juha, where very important events continued to unfold. The girl, who was very pretty in appearance, kept running around the bed with her master and looked very restless. She was shocked by the state of her master and waited for him to come to his senses, and when he began to open his eyes, she perked up. She immediately ran up to him and asked several questions about his health, although the gentleman himself immediately understood what was happening. When the girl asked him again if he was okay, he couldn't even understand where he was. Taking a quick look around the room he was lying in, I could assume that someone had cured him. He was lying in a clean and soft bed, and the whole atmosphere looked as if he had been looked after for a long time. He sat up in bed and immediately felt very dizzy and covered his eyes with his palm. The girl was very scared and did not leave his side for a step. He focused on all his sensations and realized that he had no injuries and only weakness remained in his body. The girl called him the first young gentleman and offered him a drink of water, which he did not refuse, but was very surprised at the way he was addressed. He focused his attention on what this sweet girl called him and took a sip of water and looked in the mirror at his reflection. Well, when he saw what it looked like, he was literally dumbfounded for a moment, trying to understand if he was hallucinating. Realizing that everything was really like this, the gentleman spat out all the water, choking from extreme fear. He began to pull at his skin because of his hair, thinking that someone had put such a terrible mask on him. But after trying to remove the mask he had assumed and feeling his face, he realized that there was no line that would be the border between his face and that very mask. This face was indeed his. He jumped closer to the mirror and began to examine himself more carefully, not paying attention to his own eyes and hoping for hallucinations. The girl, observing this, realized that the gentleman still had no greeting, and noting that he would bring the doctor, quickly left the chambers. Meanwhile, the gentleman was hitting himself in the face, thinking that he could simply still be sleeping and everything he saw was just an unpleasant dream. The girl, leaving the chambers and running after the doctor, noted to herself that the gentleman was even stranger in a special way than usual. The gentleman looked at himself in the mirror and wondered if this could have been the work of those two from the demonic faction, although he understood that if they could do something like that, they would have already taken control of Jianghu. But looking at his reflection, he did not understand what kind of person was looking at him from behind the looking glass. Looking around, the gentleman thought that he should find out about this as soon as possible. He carefully got out of bed and felt so weak that he could hardly move around the room with trembling legs. He could not stand for long without any support and leaned his entire weight on a table standing nearby. The gentleman noted to himself how bad his current body was, that it reminded him of a small fawn that trembled with fear when meeting a hunter. He believed that his body was simply a walking horror, and with great difficulty sat down at the table. On the table was a letter from the Enha trading group, which seemed like a familiar name to him. It was a large trading group located near Mount Jihua. They must be a fairly large trading group if he had heard of them despite having no connection to trading groups. He picked up the letter, I looked at it and wanted to know who the recipient was. And the recipient was the owner of the body. He ended up in the eldest son Li Jingyun. All the letters lying on this table were addressed to this person. These letters concerned money, gambling, and women. The gentleman looking at them and reading a little felt a certain disgust. He grabbed his head feeling great shame and angry that he could only get from these letters the name of the owner of the body he got into and what the women wanted from him. He thought about the fact that the body he was in was definitely not some kind of mask or even magic. The only thing he thought about, and what turned out to be more likely, was that he was reincarnated. Now he was no longer the king of fists but a young master, the eldest son of Li Jingyong. Well, even this thought seemed absolutely crazy to him and he didn't want to believe it. I continued to look at the letters. He thought that he must have gone crazy, but his thoughts were interrupted. A man looking very worried burst into the room and called out to him. The man literally ran across the room and immediately grabbed his wrist, trying to feel his pulse. It was Gong's son Myung Li Jingyong's doctor. Dan Wusen, who was in the body of the young master, was not familiar with this doctor and did not trust him at all. The doctor noted that the young gentleman had no idea how worried he was when he found out that something was wrong. The doctor continued to feel his master's pulse and examine his entire body. Dan Wusen abruptly pulled his hand away and assured the doctor that there was no need to worry about him because everything was fine. The doctor smiled, noting that he was glad to hear this, and notifying that the master's favorite food had been prepared. He snapped his fingers, ordering the servants to bring it. It was chicken broth, and the doctor explained that it was great for strengthening the body. Dan Wusong could only twist his face into a semblance of a smile, thinking that this chicken soup called Dragon Phoenix Soup might be a great dish for healthy people, but for a sick person like Li Jingyong, it was the equivalent of poison. Dan Wusong thought that the doctor was like a snake and also noticed that the doctor was trying to secretly check Li Jingyong's pulse, and most likely thought it was strange that Li Jingyong looked healthy. The doctor smiled and noted that if the gentleman regularly drank the soup, he would become as healthy as the youth participating in the Dragon Phoenix martial arts competition. Dan Wusen grimaced and asked how many years the Dragon Phoenix martial arts competitions had been going on, and the doctor replied that it had been about 200 years, adding that he was not sure. Dan Wusen turned away and waved his hand, saying that he had no appetite, and asked to leave the soup on one of the tables. The doctor wanted to object to this, but Dan Wusen had already led him to the door and asked him to leave and not come in, explaining that he really wanted to sleep. He slammed the door behind the doctor and leaned his back against it, thinking about the approaching 200th Dragon Phoenix competition. This meant that not much time had passed since his death, which was good enough. Dan Wusen thought that the demonic faction that he died at the hands of should also still exist. He also focused on the snake-like doctor and thought that everyone around him needed to be beaten. Dan Wusen began to warm up his hands and thought that none of these people had anything to worry about. He clenched his fists tightly and promised himself that this time he would kill everyone with just one blow. There was a lot of different food on the table. The girls were surprised every time they set the table and cleared it. The maids were surprised that their master ate a lot again and again, although he had previously eaten only porridge. They waited for him to return from his walk, wondering if he would eat all the food provided. Just after this conversation, the doors to the room opened. Dan Wusong, in the body of Mr. Li Jingyun, returned from his walk and entered the room, adjusted his hair, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He was pleased that the maid had already managed to finish preparing breakfast, and having praised her, he hurried with curiosity to see what was set on the table. Having looked at the dishes, he asked that from that day on simpler breakfasts be prepared for him, and the maid in response promised that she would fulfill his request. As she left the master's room with the other maids, the girl whispered into the ear of another, noting that their master seemed to be feeling better. When Dan Wusing had just started eating breakfast, there was another knock on his door. It was Dr. Gong San Myung. Dan Wusen was not at all happy about his appearance, but still allowed the doctor to enter. The maids opened the doors and let the doctor in to see the master. Gong San Meng entered, assuming that the master was still suffering from some kind of impotence. Dan Wusen looked at the doctor, who came to him, and smiled, thinking that he was too self-confident. The doctor, as soon as he approached Dan Wusen, greeted him, expressing great joy at seeing his master. Dan Wusen still didn't understand why the doctor was currying favor with him, and it really irritated him. But suddenly he thought that he should have caught this little rat. He felt that the doctor was not as loyal and helpful as he pretended to be. Dan Wusen took a sip of his drink and asked what had brought the doctor to him. The doctor was taken aback by the unexpectedness of the question and asked what exactly the gentleman meant. The doctor began to complain that he had not heard anything from the gentleman and unable to bear the loneliness he came himself. After this, he noted that the gentleman's complexion had become completely different and pointed out his efforts which had not been pointless. Dan Wusen took note of the doctor's words about his efforts and grimaced slightly. He grinned and asked if the doctor was referring to his attempt to poison his master with the dragon phoenix soup. Dr. Gong Men did not expect such a statement, and it was obvious that he was taken by surprise. He began to say that there must have been a misunderstanding, noting that the dragon phoenix soup was a nutritious and invigorating food. Dan Wusen probably knew that the doctor would start to defend himself in every possible way, and replied that he still thought it was poison. Gong Sanmyung was outraged by such accusations and emphasized that he was the attending personal physician and could not have thought about poisoning his master. He began to cry demonstratively and, burying his face in the sleeves of his robe, said that since he was unwelcome in this place, he would be forced to leave. The doctor immediately hurried to the exit. Dan Wusong turned to him and called his name, not letting him leave so quickly. As soon as the doctor stopped, Dan Wusong noted that he had come without an invitation, and now stated that he had left without permission. He was indignant that he was the master, not the doctor. Gan Sun Meng, hearing these words, immediately became covered in sweat from fear. His face turned red, and he froze in place. I understand that the master is very angry with him. Well, after that, Dan Wusen laughed, noting that he was just joking, and the doctor bowed and pretended to laugh, supporting his master. Dan Wusen said that he needed to send a letter and asked the doctor to bring him some writing material from the table. After the doctor brought the writing materials, the gentleman noted that he would dictate and the doctor should write everything down. Dan Wusong dictated that it was worth writing down that due to Mr. Li Jinyun's serious illness, the doctor had to stay in the estate for a while. The gentleman asked to write that since the doctor had been living in this estate for so long, he should have given advice on what to do next. But the doctor did not write down these words, realizing that he was falling into a trap again. Dan Wusen rolled his eyes and looked at the doctor, asking why he didn't write down the last dictated sentence. Dr. Gong Men looked at his master and smiled, pretending not to understand what exactly the letter was talking about. But the doctor did not laugh for long, because the gentleman could no longer contain his anger and threw a stick at him. The stick flew past the doctor and got stuck in the wall behind him. Gonson was seriously scared and didn't dare move. The stick thrown by the gentleman slightly damaged his neck, leaving behind a not very deep scratch. Dan Wusun looked at the doctor, who had completely lost his conscience, and noted that he was no longer the same Li Jinyung who had been before, and he should have only told the truth. But Dr. Gongsen Men pretended to be innocent and said that he had no idea what to tell him. Dan Wusen explained to him that he should have told him everything about the dragon phoenix soup first. The gentleman noted that for healthy people this could be a tonic, but for a sick person like him this soup was real poison. The gentleman emphasized that the doctor should have known about this. Dan Wusen was absolutely sure that the doctor had deliberately fed him such soup to make him even weaker and most likely even kill him. The gentleman noted that the doctor was stupid if he thought that such actions as checking the pulse would go unnoticed. Dan Wusen, as soon as the doctor touched his hand, understood what he was trying to do because it was hard to find other explanations. I really liked Dan Wusen that he had to explain everything to the doctor, although he was the one who had to justify himself. The gentleman also recalled that in the case when, due to lack of appetite, he asked to leave his soup on the table and not to come in until he had rested. It was at that moment that Dr. Gongsen Meng was unable to hide his intentions to kill the master. He looked very confused and angry that the gentleman refused to eat this soup, as if everything did not go according to his plan. Dan Wusen, looking at the doctor, noted that he understood that there were other people who were acting in concert with him, and asked him to write in this letter the name of the one who gave him the order. The doctor grimaced and, almost crying, asked the gentleman why he was treating him like this and could suspect such a kind person as his personal physician. He covered his eyes with his hand, pretending that he was about to cry and didn't want his master to see it. But Dan Wusen did not react to this in any way and continued to watch the doctor closely, knowing that he was about to take off his mask of a decent person. This is what actually happened the next moment. The doctor removed his hand from his face, and with an evil smile noted that even such a vile person as the gentleman still had a conscience. Dan Wusen was pleased that the doctor had finally shown his true colors, to which he noted that he had tried to let the gentleman go with dignity, and everything that was happening was complete stupidity. The doctor thought to himself that now there was no other way out and he would have to kill everyone's ears and force them to remain silent. He seemed confident that he would be able to carry out his plan, and he pulled out some kind of game from his sleeve and called out to his master. Well, as soon as he raised his gaze, you saw that the master's fist was already flying at him. He didn't even have time to react, and the blow hit him right in the face. The doctor fell face down on the table, and Dan Wusen took a piece of fried meat and asked him not to be distracted from his story any longer. He took a bite and emphasized that while the gentleman was talking, it was not worth being distracted by any other topics. After telling this to the doctor, Dan Wusen noticed his arm, which was hurting badly after the blow. He couldn't believe that he was experiencing such pain and now had such a miserable body. He examined his reddened hand again and decided that he needed to restore his former strength as quickly as possible. It didn't matter to him how he did it as long as the entire Yonha trading group was behind it. He also understood that when he returned to the group, he would have to study Gongsun Myung. Very suddenly, Dan Wusen was struck by a severe headache, so severe that he had to lean on the table. Dan Wusen didn't understand what was causing this pain, which made him almost grind his teeth, trying to cope with such an attack. He heard the voice of Dr. Gongsun Meng speaking to him. When he looked, he found the doctor standing right in front of him unharmed, and then he realized that it was not just a headache. He saw Li Jinyoung next to him before he became him. These were the memories of the former master. Now Dan Wusen has access to many of the memories of the owner of his current body. Tears started to flow from his eyes. Whether from the headache or from what he saw, he couldn't stop them. Many things began to fall into place for him. Thanks to Li Jinyoung's memories being revealed, Dan Wusen learned a lot of things that he was very interested in. Li Jinyoung, the eldest son of the wealthy Yunha trading group, was not as smart as his second brother and not as strong as his third brother. He was simply an inadequate eldest son. Most people did not think of him as special, great, or respected him enough. He tried to compensate for his shortcomings with money but ended up drowning in a depraved life of pleasure. When he realized his mistakes and decided to change, it was already too late. Much was no longer subject to either money or power, and all he could do was live with it. Was sent to this estate. Dan Wusen thought that if these memories were correct, his main clan would not be interested in this place of exile. At first, the problem was that he was garnished without the memory of this body. But now Dan Wusen could finally focus on martial arts and not waste time explaining the situation. Dan Wusong thought that after all, Mr. Li Jinyoung had lost such an innately talented body. With his knowledge from his past life and a few rare elixirs, he could quickly reach a high level. This thought gave Dan Wusong a very interesting idea. He looked around the room. His eye was drawn to one of the chests filled to the brim with gold and precious stones. All he had in Mr. Li Jinyoung's position was money, and there was nothing he couldn't afford. Then his gaze fell on the Dr. Gongsun Myung, who was still lying face down on the table. He was already dead, and Dan Wusen should think about his burial. Dan Wusen decided to act on his new plan and spend his strength and resources on his skills. The seasons changed, but he continued to work on himself and run the affairs of his estate. He tried to do everything in such a way as not to arouse excessive curiosity about himself before the desired time. He spent a whole year working hard and building his new body and reputation. He was preparing for more important decisions and wanted to change not only himself. About a year later, a guest came to visit him. The young man, seeing the maids, approached them and greeted them, which seemed to slightly frighten the girls who were not used to meeting guests in this place. His name was Ma Sip, and he was a security guard of Yonha Trading Group. He smiled and explained that he had a letter for Mr. Li Jinyoung and asked where he could find him so he could deliver the letter. The girl exhaled that it was not an enemy, smiled in response, and showed where her master was. Ma Sip looked in the direction where Mr. Li Jinyoung was and was taken aback. He saw the young gentleman in front of him, but he did not fully believe that he could have changed so much. His body was perfect. Instead of a skinny, sickly youth, Ma Sip saw before him a strong and robust young gentleman. who could show off his muscles to everyone. Dan Wusen certainly noticed that several seasons had already passed. During this time his energy essence manifested and he engraved on this body all the martial arts necessary for survival. He called them the art of enlightened mobility and the art of the enlightened body. There was also an art called by him as a quick step, and the most interesting was the art that allowed him to control lightning. It was called the art of white lightning in 10 phases. On that day he reached the 4th phase of this art. For the new master everything went smoothly. There were no problems on the way to his establishment. Dan Wusen became very fast in his new body. Mr. Li Jingyun himself was very weak and therefore slow. Dan Wusen managed to upgrade his body to such an extent that anyone who knew the previous owner of this body would not recognize him. Dan Wusen in his new body was able to perform the techniques he learned in his previous real body, and it came easy to him. He could cut a tree leaf into small pieces in a split second even before it reached the ground. But he thought that all these achievements were very little for him. Dan Wusen was convinced that he was still weak. One of his training sessions was interrupted. A voice he had not heard before called his name. It was Mok In Sip. First he greeted the gentleman and introduced himself. Then he bowed and explained that he had brought a letter from the main clan. This news surprised Dan Wusen, but he did not show it and agreed to find out what was written there. He asked to give him the letter, noting that it was imperative that he read it. Mok In Sip, watching the gentleman, could not believe his eyes that it was really him. He was amazed that the fragile little guy he knew had changed so much. Mok In Sip was so engrossed in looking at the gentleman that he forgot to hand him the letter. Dan Wusen held his hand outstretched for a long time and eventually nervously noted that he was tired of standing in that position. They went into the hall, and sitting down at the table Dan Wusen decided to finally read the letter. It was stated there that the father became ill and lay in bed without getting up. The letter did not explain the cause of his illness, which made Dan Wusen think. After thinking for a while, he suggested what could be the reason for his father's illness. The only reason why the old man could have fallen ill was because of Ouyang's clone. Mok In Sip noted that their group paid tribute under the pretext of payment for protection. Well, these payments accumulated and at that point became unbearable. Dan Wusen asked if the Ouyang clan would do anything to deserve the increase in such fees. At this point Mok In Sip started to get very angry, and calling all the members of the clan with dogs complained that they did nothing at all. Even when the little deity sect recently tried to impose inappropriate trade taxes, the Ouyang clan remained silent. Moreover, they said that they would meet with the main clan of the Yonha trading group only in case of serious problems. Mok In Sip said that their security captain couldn't even protest because it was about Ouyang Hu. Having said this, the young man immediately fell silent, unable to find more correct words. Dan Wusen had heard of Ouyang Hu because he was well known in Jianghu. He was strong enough that someone like Dan Wusen knew about him. Dan Wusen thought that Ouyang Hu probably thought that trading groups like his were inferior, and that was understandable. Dan Wusen decided that he just needed to deal with the clan and then everything would be fine. These words surprised Mok In Sip, but he remained silent and noted that there was another very important reason for his father's collapse. He said that there was a sword fight between the 2nd and 3rd young masters, and after his father witnessed it he collapsed. Dan Wusen immediately realized that his father's illness was due to his anger. He could not cope with his emotions and simply fell from helplessness. Dan Wusen covered his face with his hand in indignation. He couldn't believe that his brothers would fight in front of the head of the merchant group, and even with swords. Mok In Sip thought that the gentleman was simply afraid and tried to convince him that he was not in any danger, but Dan Wusen was only thinking that he could not just sit and watch what was happening. Dan Wusen stood up and said that Mok In Sip could leave a letter. He walked closer to Mok In Sip, who remained in his chair, and looked at him carefully. After thinking for a bit, Dan Wusen told him that he would go and sort out these conflicts himself. When Mok In Sip returned, he immediately reported to everyone that Li Jingyun had completely changed. He said that he became an ideal martial artist and his body was simply amazing. But for those he told it to, it sounded like something fantastic. No one could imagine what this young man was talking about. Some people laughed at this news and thought that it was all nonsense and that the young gentleman remained a talentless fool. They made various jokes and noted that if Li Jingyun was a martial artist, then they were probably legendary martial artists. One of the men noted that even saying that the deputy captain had a mistress sounded more plausible. And it was worth trying before joking like that. This man was extremely confident in what he was saying and did not even think to suggest that it could be true. But Han Yip, the deputy captain of the Yona Trading Group's security force, believed that young master Li Jinyoung had truly regained his health. He noted that he had always been in excellent physical condition since childhood, so it was not surprising that he was able to achieve good results. He asked Mok and Sip if he knew when the young master was going to return. Sip, watching Han Yip hold the man's head, who laughed at this information, said that he didn't know for sure the master promised to come himself. Immediately after these words, one of the servants shouted that the young master Jinyoung had arrived, and Sip emphasized that this moment had probably arrived. The man who was being held down decided to go and greet the young gentleman, although the other doubted whether they really should greet this worthless man. Han Yip noted that no one should forget who fed them, and it was worth going to meet the one who himself expressed a desire to visit them. Looking around, Wusen was stunned by what he saw. The beauty and the city's cleaner delighted him because previously he could only guess what everything looked like in this city. He had only heard of the Yona Trading Group in stories, but he couldn't believe that they were actually that powerful. He thought that Jin Yunmi was just moderately wealthy but was practically born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Having met the maids, he noted that he would go straight to his father and told them to go and rest. The girls smiled at him and went away. Walking further through the square, Wusen thought that something was wrong. He was very interested in why no one had met him yet, because in theory many should have come running. As soon as he thought about it, he heard the sound of feet and voices. Looking back, he saw a detachment of soldiers heading towards him. They immediately lined up in rows on the sides and assumed a welcoming position. Thus he was congratulated on the safe return of young master Jinyoung. Han Yip immediately appeared in front of him and introduced himself as the vice captain of the security detachment. Bowing, he looked at the young gentleman and noted that he was almost unrecognizable. A veto captain also noted that he was very glad to see that the young gentleman looked healthy, although his subjects were outraged by such behavior and believed that their captain had no pride. I don't remember that the young master always looked down on the vice captain, and yet now Han Yip continued to act very helpfully towards this man. The young gentleman always tried to tease the vice captain, initially to hurt or push him, and always laughed at it. Some of the guards still believed that the young master would ridicule their captain again. Well, to their surprise, the young master's greeting was completely different from before. He thanked everyone, noting that it was a very warm welcome for a problematic person, and smiled broadly. Han Yip asked permission to take the young master to his father. The rest of the guards stood frozen in shock, their mouths open. They were shocked that this worthless gentleman thanked them, which had never happened before. Mok and Sip whispered to this that he said that the young master had changed a lot, and one of the guards agreed with this and said that he felt like he was in a stranger's house. The most surprised was Han Yip, who followed the gentleman escorting him to his father and tried to understand whether it was all his imagination. He turned out to be more of an enemy to him, or rather an ally. The appearance of the new master was too surprising for the entire court, for everyone who knew him. Wusen immediately went to his father's losses and stopped near the door. Han Yip smiled and said that he had already warned the young master's father of his arrival, and Wusong thanked him for that as well. Han Yip was crazy about the new changes in the one whose favor he had won through years of service and patience with all his whims. Another young man appeared near the chambers, and after casting a glance at Jin Yen, noted that he was worth looking at longer. The young man walked up and placed his hand on Wusen's shoulder, who still didn't understand who this person was. It was the third son of the Yanga Trading Group, named Li Jayan. He smirked when he noticed that their lazy Li Jinyun had come to visit them. Wusen didn't respond to this, and Li Jayan said that Li Jinyun's face loss made him a completely different person. According to Li Jayan, his brother could surprisingly even look menacing. Han Yip became worried at that moment, thinking that Li Jayan would start beating his brother again, because he always did this when they met, because he considered him an ordinary thorn and knew that he would not be able to fight back. He decided that it was worth defusing the situation, and laughing and taking his third son by the hand, he began to talk about how the two brothers had finally met after a long time, and they probably both wanted to see each other again. But the third son didn't like it. He immediately hit the vice captain for daring to touch his body without permission. This was incomprehensible to Wusen. He had little knowledge of his brother or this captain, nor did he know what had happened in this manner before he had reincarnated into the young master's body. Li Jiayun hissed that one incompetent person was enough, and now the deputy captain was looking down on him. he started shouting that the captain should be taught a lesson so that he would never again be able to look people taller than him in the eyes, but Dan Wusen did not like this behavior of the Brahma at all. Dan Wusen called out to him and reached his hand towards his face as if to stroke or brush the hair away from his face, which at first did not seem too suspicious to Jayan. But as soon as Jinyong's hand got close enough, Jayan immediately received a hard blow to the face. There was a deep cut on his cheek and his face expressed bewilderment. Han Yip was the most shocked of all because he certainly didn't expect that the young master who had humiliated him all his life would suddenly stand up for him. Jayan fell to the floor and immediately began to curse at how his brother could afford to do so much. Dan Wusen pulled the card out again and said that he had been very excited on the way home. Jayan didn't move from his spot and let his brother grab his shoulder, but as soon as his hand touched his shoulder, he immediately regretted it, howling in pain. He began to curse even more and communicate with Dan Wusen in every possible way and tried to break free from this grip. Jayan called him a psycho, but Dan Wusen smiled and hissed that he should have called him Big Brother. The young master's changes caused a stir in his father's estate. Many discussed his extremely trainable behavior. It was also noisy in one of the corridors, but for a different reason. Li Huayi, the second son of the Yona trading group who was also a supervisor, noticed that a lot of people had gathered near his father's room while walking down the hallway. He immediately approached and asked Han Yip why there was such a noise, and he said that there was a quarrel between the first and third young masters. Wei Yun immediately thought that the third one must have provoked his older brother again because this happened all the time. Wei Yun immediately began to curse loudly at the security guards, who simply stood there instead of stopping them. But when Wei Yun burst into the room, he saw that Jin Yun was holding her younger brother's ear, ordering him to be quiet, since they were right in front of their father's room. Jin Yong immediately noticed his brother's appearance, but he never let go of the younger one. Wei Yun was stunned by this picture because he never expected that his second brother would restrain the third and not vice versa. After this conflict, the brothers gathered together at the table and had a cup of tea. Wei Yun was the only one who sat down at the table and started drinking tea, while the other brothers were still trying to figure out who was the boss. Taking a sip of tea, Wei Yun noted that he had heard about the return of his second brother and smiled. He also emphasized that his second brother looked completely fine, and this could not but please. Jin Yong confirmed that he was indeed in good condition. Jin Yong's gaze immediately fell on his older brother's annotated hand, and he wondered if their third brother had done it. Wei Yun wanted to convince Jin Yun that it wasn't that big of a deal, but he had already started beating Jayan up for what he had done. He hit him in the face without any mercy. I want to teach this boy respect for his older brothers. He kept saying that the younger one shouldn't have raised a sword against his older brother. He didn't want to be beaten. Jayan promised that this would not happen again, although he was incredibly angry that someone could do this to him. His pride didn't allow him to simply accept that Li Jin could beat him up, and this made him even more angry. He used to be very weak, but now he suppressed it with extraordinary ease and made it obey. Wei Yun watched them and thought that Jin Yun really humiliated Jayan, although before the best he could do was avoid his younger brother's fists. When Jin Yong sat down at the table opposite his older brother, he asked if anything had happened in the estate because he looked like a completely different person. Jin Yong looked at the scrolls lying on the table in front of him and replied that his older brother really had a keen eye and was able to recognize the changes in him. But at the same time, his gaze was completely riveted to these scrolls. He was incredibly interested in what was written there. Wei Yun explained that these were lists of employees that he needed to take with him to the upcoming conference. Jin Yun decided to get to know them and found the name of her attending physician, Gong's son Myung. He wanted to know who recommended this person, although he understood that it seemed that this was no longer necessary. The person who recommended all these people from the deputy commander of the guards and the guard at the entrance gate was Ouyang Hu. Jin Yong was convinced of this, and moreover he was very eager to meet this person. Jin Yong addressed his brothers by name, his voice sounding very harsh and rough. His face changed, and he said that if any of his brothers were working with the Ouyang clan, he would have to admit it right then and there. Neither of the brothers expected such a statement and froze for a moment looking at him. The elder brother was the first to speak. He was outraged that his second brother actually believed that this was possible, and Jayan agreed with this and called it simply ridiculous. Jayan noted that he would rather die than let a member of another clan take over his business, since the Yona trading group was a precious business that his father had worked hard to raise. Jin Yong smiled and replied that he was glad to hear that. He thought to himself that he wouldn't have to kill anyone, which also made him happy. Jin Yong stood up and asked if all the top officials would be present at this conference, and Wei Yong assured that this would indeed be the case. Jin Yong, without thinking for long, said that in that case he would also be present at this conference. Having stated this, he immediately headed for the exit, and when his older brother demanded to explain where he was going, he shared that he was going to his father. As Jin Young disappeared behind the door, Wei Young asked Jayan, trying to understand what happened in their brother's estate that caused him to change so much. Jayan started jumping and pulling his hair, shouting that he should have gone to Mount Jihua. Jin Yong actually went to see his father. The guard warned the master about the son's arrival, and he ordered to let him in. Jin Yong calmly walked into his father's room with his head slightly bowed down. Lee Sung-min, who was the leader of the Yona trading group, and Lee Jin Young's father, was happy that his son had finally come to him. He heard some noise outside and asked his son what the reason was, but Lee Jin assured him that nothing was happening there. Jin Yong sat down next to his father's bed and said that he heard that his father was not feeling well due to stress. And then, confirming this, he explained that he had always been under stress, but now his aging body could no longer cope with it. The old man extended his hand to his son, saying that he had changed a lot. He stroked his cheek, noting that his face looked different, and asked if he was really Jin Young. After that, Lee Sung-min smiled and said that he was glad to see that his son was doing well. This moment seemed very strange to Dan Wusen in Lee Jin Young's body. The touch of his now father caused him strange feelings. He grew up without parents, so he did not know what it was like to have a father. He had access to Lee Jin Young's childhood memories. In one of those memories, he was a little boy watching his father lead his older brother by the hand while he stayed behind. As a child, he experienced mixed emotions when looking at his father. There was admiration and resentment in it, and childish love and affection. For little Lee Jin Young, his father was a very great and important person. He was a real hero to his son and led the little child, guiding and helping. But now everything was different when Lee Jin Young held his sick father's hand. Lee Jin Young didn't understand when his father became so small, fragile, and weak, and where his former greatness went. Jin Yong turned to his father and asked him not to worry. He noted that they simply needed to remove the cause of his stress and squeezed his hand tighter with her too. Jin Yong promised him that he would sort it out and his father shouldn't worry about it. But when Lee Sung-min heard this, he was very surprised and wanted to ask again if he heard it correctly. But Jin Yong smiled at him, assured him that he hadn't said anything important, and asked his father to rest as much as possible. The next day, the Enha Trade Group conference took place. This conference brought together very important and influential people to discuss pressing issues. Ouyang Hu, the commander of the guards in the Yanga Trading Group and the martial artist of the Ouyang clan, was also present at this conference. But the biggest noise was caused by the appearance of Lee Jin Yong's eldest son at this conference. Many people were whispering among themselves and also whispering to Ouyang Hu about it. No one understood what the young gentleman was doing at this conference, since he was usually absent from any such events. All those present could not take their eyes off him to guess why he came to such a conference. Ouyang Hu watched the young master and smiled. He said that the young master was probably worried about his position in the group and therefore came to the conference when his father fell ill. Wei Yun paused while reading the decision and asked if anyone in the room had a different opinion before moving on to other questions. Ouyang Hu raised his hand, noting that he had a different opinion and he wanted to express it. He noted that he had heard that the first young master still had no security despite having returned, and that one person could be recommended to him. Some people in the hall began to whisper that half of the Yanga trading group already consisted of people from the Ouyang clan, and apparently Ouyang Hu did not know when it was time to stop. The man who spoke about this was holding a glass in his right hand, but immediately after speaking his glass seemed to burst. In fact, the needle that Ouyang Hu was twirling in his teeth flew into the glass and broke it. Ouyang Hu complained with glee that his hand had slipped, and that was why such an embarrassment had occurred. He reached back for his needle, admitting his guilt, although it was clear that he did it on purpose to shut up the people who were disrespecting him in their conversations. After that, he asked if there was anyone who wanted to speak out about his proposal, but no one dared to add anything. A rather satisfied smile had already appeared on his face, but suddenly someone still dared to volunteer. It was Lee Jin Young. His face was absolutely calm, and it seemed that on the contrary such events depressed him and made him bored. But as soon as all the people turned to look at him, his face took on a more serious look, and he noted that he had a complaint. He stood up and approached Ouyang Hu and said that he also wanted to make a proposal. He pointed his finger at the security commander of the Yanga trading group Ouyang Hu and stated that he had a proposal to fire this man. Most were stunned by this statement and thought it was just some kind of joke. People close to Ouyang Hu noted that apparently the young master did not know how much the commander of the security detachment cared about the safety of the trading group. At this statement, even the commander of the guards Ouyang Hu laughed loudly, believing that it was impossible. He laughed because the young gentleman wanted to fire him, and he was very interested in how events would develop further. Ouyang Hu looked into the young master's eyes and noted that he had probably forgotten because he had been lying in bed for so long that it was none of his business. But Jin Yong didn't agree with this and smilingly asked if the security commander was really so confident in his words. He did not wait for any suitable moment but immediately began to solve the problem with his fist. The blow was so strong that the chair behind which the security commander was sitting immediately crumbled, and in addition the floor underneath it scattered into small stones to the sides. The clouds of dust quickly cleared and everything around became clear. Ouyang Hu no longer looked so confident after being hit by Li Jinyong, who was still very close and literally David with his gaze. Jin Yong told Owen Hu that he must have forgotten something because he had gained some influence. Without waiting for any guesses, Jin Yong reminded that the Yona trading group belonged to the eldest son, that is him. Yun followed his older brother, assuming that he joined the general meeting because he was going to fire the captain of the guard. I fully support this because he was just from a group of merchants and could not interfere with them. Jin Young stopped abruptly and turned to Young. He asked if he knew what happened when a martial artist Jiang Hu was underestimated. Yun looked at him confused, not knowing what to answer. Jin Yong smiled and explained that whoever made such a proposal must have been consumed. He asked his brother to look at the current status of the Yona trading group. Yun understood what his brother was talking about, but he was afraid to admit it. Jin Yong asked if his brother was reading that the group was being absorbed right now. Jin Yong didn't need to be constantly present at the headquarters to understand that. Yun mentally agreed that his brother was right and wondered when Ouyang's clone had grown to such a number. Jin Yong placed his hand on his brother's shoulder, reassuring him that there was nothing to worry about. He emphasized that he was the older brother and would sort things out completely without involving the younger ones. Yun was very pleased to hear this, although he did not fully understand what his older brother was capable of and what his showdowns could lead to. He was afraid that his elder brother would deal with this whole situation in the same way as he did with the security commander Ouyang Hu. What happened at the conference made many nervous. Some began to understand that the appearance of the eldest son of the group's leader puts them at great risk of losing their status. Ouyang Hu, thinking about what had happened, did not understand what this scandalous young man was thinking, assuming that he had finally gone crazy. Ma Sop acted as a guard and jumped out in front of his master and asked him to step back, trying to stop Ouyang Hu, noting that he had no right to turn his sword against the young master. Some of the guards also came to the defense of their master and, drawing their swords, formed a wall around him. Jin Yong said that it was indeed true. He adjusted his hair and rolled his eyes, noting that it was truly impudent. He stressed that it was not worth pointing the sword against his employer. Jin Yong smiled and said that apparently the little rascals really did want to die since they did something like that. He also noted that since he felt a little guilty in front of the captain of the guard, he could perhaps consider this compensation. Ouyang Hu was surprised that the young master felt guilty. Jin Yong walked closer to him and explained that he felt guilty because he ruined the security captain's plans for his retirement. Jin Yong noted that it was Ouyang Hu who asked the Dr. Gong's son Myung to kill him when he left for treatment. Jin Yong was also convinced that it was Ouyang Hu who framed the second and third brothers, because when there was enmity between brothers, everything became much simpler. Due to all these events, the leader of the Enha trading group himself fell ill. Jin Yong quickly saw through the whole scheme and figured out who was in charge. It wasn't that hard, considering he only had to influence one of the sons. Ouyang Hu could seize control of the Yanga trading group without lifting a finger. Ouyang Hu only laughed loudly at these assumptions, noting that this was just a pure illusion. Jin Yong walked a little closer to the security captain. He put his hand on the shoulder of the captain of the guard and said that Gong's son Myung, who was originally supposed to kill him, died by his own hand. Jin Yong noted that it was from that moment that the fate of the captain of the guard began to change and horror flashed in Ouyang Hu's eyes. This further confirmed that it was Ouyang Hu was guilty and plotting such a nasty thing against the trading company. Ouyang Hu couldn't believe that the eldest son of the trading group leader Li Jinyong killed the doctor, but Jinyong asked the captain not to mourn for the doctor since he could be killed with just one blow. Jinyong turned away and noted that if the captain of the guard wanted to absorb a large trading group, then he should have tried. And now he was about to be sued for damages. Ouyang Hu instantly became furious at this and rushed at the young master, calling him names and cursing at him in every possible way. Jinyong turned to him and glared, noting that he had been caught after all and now could not get away. Ouyang Hu was blinded by anger and shouted that the young master must have really wanted to die since he could allow himself to talk about such things. He got into fights with the young master and nothing could stop him. Li Jinyong accepted the fight and struck back at the security captain. Everyone nearby covered themselves with their hands. The serious fight between Jinyong and Ouyang Hu raised dust and many objects flew to the sides. Ouyang Hu was very surprised when he discovered that the young master had studied lightning energy and martial arts in general. After the first fight, the opponents went to different corners of the hall to gather strength and plan further attacks. Everyone was amazed that Li Jinyong, who had never shown much promise, now knew martial arts and could block the punch of the security captain. Jinyong touched his neck and winced in pain, asking if he should have fought if he had just recovered. He immediately noted that he would turn a blind eye to this because it was already an official duel. Ouyang Hu was seething with anger. He thought that the master was an arrogant bastard who was as self-confident as a chick that had just learned to fly. He turned to the guards and witnesses from the Ouyang clan and asked them to confirm that, with the consent of Mr. Jinyong, they would hold an official duel. Afterwards, Ouyang Hu grinned evilly and looked at the young master and asked if that was enough. Jinyong, preparing for battle, replied that it was too little. He was determined to have a life-or-death duel and could not accept any other. Ouyang Hu took out his sword and approached Jinyong, a little saying that he seemed to have studied in an impressive sect. How could his skill level have become so decent in such a short time? He jumped forward very sharply, noting that he, however, lacked experience in such battles. Ouyang Hu wanted to show the young master what the difference was and rushed towards him with an attack. Jinyong was surprised that the captain of the guard was talking about some kind of experience. He didn't even know what his opponent was capable of and easily dodged the attack. Ouyang Hu never expected that the young man would be able to dodge his sword so quickly, and was taken aback when he discovered that he had not hit the young master at all. He immediately rushed to attack again, but Jinyong said that they were unable to tell him anything about the experience. With just one hand, he grabbed the captain of the guard and threw him back, saying that he still needed to live 100 years to talk about experience, and called him a baby. Ouyang Hu couldn't shake it off and flew away as if he had no weight. He was surprised where the young master got such enormous strength that he was able to simply grab a person and throw him like a small branch. Jinyong followed him and noted that he should have been allowed to show the captain what a real difference in experience looked like. He used the enlightened art of movement against the captain of the guard. His skills and strength were truly impressive. Ouyang Hu himself was especially shocked, as he was completely unable to resist the young master's attack. He tried to block Jinyong's next attack with his sword, but it was very difficult for him to do so. He couldn't stand on his feet under the onslaught of Jinyong's enormous strength. All he could do was try to protect himself and try his best to escape the attack. He couldn't find a way to control Jinyong and couldn't always even block his attacks. Ouyang Hu understood that something was wrong, and someone like Jinyong couldn't possibly come to such a result so quickly and suddenly. He knew this didn't sound like someone who was just starting to learn martial arts. Jinli was too strong and skilled, although just recently he couldn't even fight back against his younger brother, who constantly humiliated him. Ouyang Hu clearly understood that young master Li Jinyong's skills were similar to that of an experienced martial artist. He did not believe that such a thing was even possible and could not admit it to himself for a long time. Many of the guards were already standing there watching the fight with smiles on their faces, realizing that Li Jinyong was going to finish off the captain of the guard. But Ouyang Hu did not give up and shouted that he would never lose in this duel, and used the three-form melee art. He shouted that a mediocrity like Jinyong would not be able to defeat such a great man as he considered himself to be. But But Jin Yong took advantage of his quick steps, and in an instant he was right next to Ouyang Hu, who was dumbfounded by this. He didn't have time to understand when Li Jinyoung managed to move so quickly from literally the other end of the room. The last thing that security captain Ouyang Hu saw was Li Jinyoung's satisfied face and heard him saying goodbye to him. Li Jinyoung's very powerful punch landed right on Ouyang Hu's chin from below. The blow was so good that the captain of the guard was thrown into the air. The spectacle was mesmerizing for everyone present, who watched Ouyang Hu's final flight with their mouths open. It was a strange sight, but most understood that things would be much better for everyone now. This duel could be heard for several blocks around. The fight was so intense that dust rose from the windows of this building and was visible to many residents. The doctor, seeing this, asked the leader of the trading group, hoping that he could explain what was happening. Lee Sung-min folded his hands on his lap and replied that it was his son. His face was very concerned, but at the same time it expressed some satisfaction. He said that his son seemed to have learned martial arts, and while he was saying this, one could hear the father's great pride in his child. Lee Jin-young looked at the body of the former captain of the Yona Trading Group security with disgust and contempt. He lay motionless, and the students were broken. His whole face was smeared with blood, and he showed no signs of life. The people close to him immediately rushed to his aid with shouts, hoping that he could still be helped. One of the people picked up his commander in his arms and, looking at Jin Yen, called him an impudent man. Jin Yong asked if this guard wanted to be killed along with his commander. Another of the guards stepped forward and said that there were no violations in the duel of young master Jin Yong which he could testify to. But he added that at that moment, however, if the Ouyang clan continued to demand revenge through duels, then the Yanga Trading Group would not be able to avoid them. This statement horrified many because in general no one wanted such serious conflicts. Jin Yong, after hearing this, agreed and noted that he had never hoped to get rid of hatred anyway. He added that if he is shown kindness he will respond in kind, but if he is shown hatred he will respond to that as well. He warned that if anyone was against this, the responsibility would lie solely with him and not with the Yonha Trading Group. Jayan was worried and shouted out that it was too dangerous. Jin Yong, as he walked away, said that the Yona Trading Group belonged to him. But this trading group also belonged to his father. She belonged to the guards who met the young gentleman who returned early in the morning. She belonged to the stable staff who took joy in simply watching their master eat. Jin Yong, I would like to emphasize that their Yanga Trading Group had no intention of falling for the games of such scumbags as the Ouyang clan. Jin Yong looked at the guard who called him a scoundrel and hissed at him that if he understood what he was told then he should get out, and noted that everyone was fired. The trade group security almost burst into tears of happiness upon hearing this decree. But the clan's guards were very angry, although no one dared to contradict this. One of them merely wished the young master good luck before his entire group left the hall. After the people from the Ouyang clan left, Jin Yong spoke to his people who were definitely waiting for at least some words from him. Everyone was amazed by what they saw with their own eyes. Makin Sip could not contain his emotions and blushed, shouting that the young master had indeed won, although Han Yip tried to shut his mouth by force. He pointed out that On Sop was a fool for being happy, since all the guards should have been ashamed for simply standing and watching. Jin Young turned to the head administrator, who was Li Wai Young, and he immediately approached to hear instructions. Jin Yong asked to buy him an elixir, hoping that his request would be fulfilled. He noted that he had taken responsibility, so he should have received at least such support in the form of the purchased elixir. Wai Yun smiled and replied that since it was for his brother, he would prepare the best quality tonic. Wai Yun was willing to help because Jin Yun had a lot of work to do. He needed to hire new guards, and it was not the time to look for elixirs. Hearing his brother's words, Jin Yong noted that he wanted to speak up in advance about hiring security. He already had several people as an example that he would like to see among the security. Meanwhile, one of the gentlemen was informed about what had happened at the Yanga Trading Company. The gentleman asked whether his man was sure that he had seen Li Jinyoung. A few days ago, on Li Jinyoung's first day of work at the Yona Trading Group, something interesting also happened. Li Jinyoung walked through the courtyard with Vice Captain Han Yip. Jin Yong looked at the Vice Captain, thinking about something. He asked if the Vice Captain had already eaten while he was only thinking about it, but Han Yip did not immediately understand what the gentleman meant. He looked at the gentleman and asked if he meant him specifically, and explained that he had been working since early morning and had not had time for this. The young gentleman sighed and smiled, looking at the frowning vice-captain. The young master glanced to the side, surprised by Han Yip's answer, which apparently told the truth. Below there were several security guards who were laughing and apparently had a small snack. It was strange to the young master that some people did not even have time to eat and earn money while others were lazy during working hours. He thought that it must have been easy for them because they lived on other people's money, and he decided that he really should get rid of them. But he understood that there was some problem with this. The problem was that Jin Yong needed someone who could replace these lazy guards and do the job well. After walking a little further across the courtyard, the young gentleman stopped abruptly. He looked at the tall building decorated with lanterns from which came the noise of many people's voices. It was something like a tavern. Many people were sitting there at tables and playing board games. Some were dancing, spending time with their love, or just drinking a lot. But of course there were more people who were puzzled by winning at board games. During the game we didn't smoke and drank a little, but only a little, just to relax. When the young gentleman entered the tavern, a man from one of the tables whispered to his friend that this was most likely the weakling they were talking about. He asked his friend to take a closer look and noted that it was a young gentleman from the Yonha trading group whom everyone considered a loser. The young gentleman with a very gloomy face walked around the tavern and looked around carefully, listening to what people were talking about. The players who were interested in his identity were convinced that it was really him, although they thought that he had been dead for a long time. Now they were interested in how much money the young gentleman would throw away this time. Vit usually spent incredibly high amounts. Li Jin-young walked past the bustling hall and approached a passageway that was covered with curtains and ropes with a sign hanging on it. He walked past them and found himself near the doors where security was provided. The guard saw the young gentleman and was a little surprised, not expecting to see him that evening. The guard smiled, noting that he and the gentleman had not seen each other for a long time, and expressed that he was glad that he had finally made a generous donation without almost being sentenced or saying anything bad. But Li Jin-young rudely told the guard not to touch him and threatened to turn him into pork fat. Then he ordered him to open the doors. The security guard was very upset by this, and he wanted to prevent, the gentleman from going inside, but he didn't react strongly to these attempts. Vanya entered the room. The young gentleman stopped right at the entrance and closed the door behind him. He found himself in a room where there was a large round table and 3 people. The gentleman, seeing who had come to see him, was also surprised that Li Jin-young had decided to come after all. Li Jin-young didn't answer him and continued to look at him with a very serious face. The gentleman noted that Li Jin-young looked better and that the treatment had apparently done him good. This gentleman was called the poisonous fox Chulmunho. The poisonous fox's guards were 2 strong twins named Yug Jinbo and Yug Myunbo, who also greeted each other, noting that they had not seen the young master for a long time. Poison Leaf was indignant that this was some kind of heartless greeting, although his friend had fallen ill and had finally recovered after a long time, and it was worth asking him at least about business. The twins asked for forgiveness, noting that they did not know about the disease. The poisonous fox emphasized that they should have shown much more concern for his personality. Li Jin-young and Chulmunho have been friends since childhood. Although their friendship was very strange from the outside and allowed physical violence against each other, the guys somehow maintained a relationship. Sometimes it was about money, but even despite financial conflicts, they continued to communicate. This friendship included one-sided violence and financial exploitation. Jin-young heard that the poisonous leaf called him a friend, thought that apparently the modern definition of this word among young people had changed a little, and sat down at the table. Chulmunho said that now that he had returned after a long absence, he should have some fun, because surely the master wanted some entertainment after he had been recovering for so long. In fact, it was the poisonous fox who wanted some entertainment because he had no one to give him money, and he said that in order to celebrate the return of young Master Jin-young from the Yong trading group, he had prepared something great for him. But Jin-young again did not react to these words. The poisonous fox was indignant that he had been silent all the time, and this irritated him. Jin-young, but in a very calm voice, replied that he was just thinking. The poisonous leaf asked about what. Jin-young thought all this time about whether he should kill this man or leave him alive. It wasn't Chulmunho he needed. The twins were the only ones who carried out all his orders, and in general it was possible to get rid of only their obedience to the poisonous fox. They probably lived like bouncers under his command and seemed to have little or no personal opinion of their own. They were too valuable to rot under Chulmunho's leadership, or so Li Jin-young believed. After a short silence, the young gentleman replied that he had decided everything. Chulmunho was indignant that his friend was not listening at all, but Jin Yong assured that he had heard everything. He smiled and demanded that she give him the key to the safe first and held out his hand waiting. Chulmunho and the twins looked at the young master in bewilderment, not understanding what he meant and whether he was joking. The poisonous fox noted that this was some kind of nonsense and asked if the young master wanted money from him. Jin Yong confirmed this, noting that he would have just taken cash. He started listing that there were thousands of niangs that he was forced to invest in this gambling company, interest, extortion of money, and medical bills for the fact that they beat him. After thinking for a little while, Jin Yong said that, in his opinion, he should receive about 100,000 niang, which would be very fair. Waiting for the poisonous fox to answer him at least something, Jin Yong thought that perhaps he asked for too little. Chulmunho realized everything he heard from the young master and laughed, thinking that he was simply making fun of him. He literally became hysterical and couldn't stop laughing loudly, and his pupils dilated to the limit. The poisonous fox noted that the young master had most likely been studying arithmetic while recovering and continued to laugh. Chulmunho stood up and, leaning his hands on the table, he called the young master a crazy bastard. He pointed to the iron bars behind him and asked him if he thought there was only 100,000 in the safe, noting that there were also valuables, gold and silver, in the safe. He walked closer to Li Jinyang and fell silent for a moment. He leaned close and, taking hold of the young gentleman's shoulder, hissed that there was nothing for him in this safe. The poisonous fox stated that if the young master needed money, he should have simply said so and borrowed it, but not asked for the key to the safe. Li Jinyang looked down at the floor and didn't respond to the poisonous fox. Chulmunho lost his self-control and asked why Li Jinyang always ignored him and continued to do so. A wolfish grin appeared on his face, and he was ready to pull the gentleman's hair and beat him severely for such behavior. Chulmunho said that Li Jinyang was acting like a human just because he was a patient, but now he was frowning and demanding the key to the safe and ignoring everyone, which no one liked at all. Li Jinyang remained silent, and the poisonous fox, unable to bear it, began to shout for him to pick himself up and remember who he came to. These screams also did not cause any reaction from Li Jinyang, and Chulmunho rolled his eyes in helplessness, exhaled, and covered his face with his hand. Chulmunho leaned even closer to Li Jinyang and grabbed his face and asked what was happening to him and whether he wanted to die, but he still didn't answer. The poisonous face was running out of patience, and he ordered the twins to pin him to the ground, assuming that a couple of blows to the head would help the master to perk up. The twins immediately rushed to carry out their order and grabbed Li Jinyang and tried to put him on the floor. But they did not succeed right away because the young gentleman resisted and moreover began to be indignant that they actually decided to do this to him. I felt such strong resistance and heard that the gentleman began to talk. The twins were a little taken aback. The young gentleman grabbed one of the twins and said that he simply decided to show leniency to the poisonous fox. After this, he grabbed the twin and pushed him with great force to the side. This was surprising because the man was several times larger than Li Jinyong himself and was also the bodyguard of the poisonous fox, which meant he had a lot of strength. But surprisingly, Li Jinyong was so strong that he pushed the thug and almost broke the metal grate that closed the safe. But the second twin immediately reacted and attacked the young master with his fists. But Li Jinyang was also very tested and was able to dodge this attack very quickly. Li Jinyang fell to the ground, dodging his twin's attack and preparing to counterattack. As soon as the twin stepped aside, the young master immediately decided to make his own attack. He managed to land a kick and hit the twin right in the head. The twin remained on his feet, although he felt severe pain in his jaw. But Li Jinyang immediately attacked again, and this time knocked the big guy to the floor. Well, even after this blow, he failed to make his twin lose consciousness. This seemed very surprising to him. He liked that he had not made a mistake with his choice because such steadfastness would be very useful in his company. The twins came to their senses very quickly and were already advancing on him. Immediately after their fall, the twins quickly rose to their feet as if nothing had happened. It felt like they didn't feel any pain at all because usually a good blow could put a person out of action for some time. Both twins had broken wrists and ankles, which could have prevented them from continuing the fight. However, there was not a drop of fear in their eyes, but rather the opposite. They wanted to get involved in this massacre even more. These are the kind of people Li Jinyang needed. I don't understand this. He smiled broadly. The twins immediately pounced on Li Jinyang, and it seemed that it would be difficult to return from two such giants. But Li Jinyang didn't tense up much when the twins attacked. Even his face showed the utmost calm. Having planned everything, Jinyong seemed to evaporate right from under the thugs' noses because he had figured out how to act against them. It was a surprise to both of them. They couldn't immediately figure out where Li Jinyoung had gone. Li Jinyoung was right behind them, standing still with his hands clasped behind his back and watching their confusion. He grabbed each of the twins' heads tightly with his hands. Before the blow, Li Jinyoung said that the twins were too valuable to just rot under Chulmunho. After these words, the young gentleman hit their heads together and stunned them. He let them go and told them to stay where they were, as he would not warn them twice. Having dealt with the twins, Li Jinyoung flexed his wrists, noting that now there was only one thing left to do, and looked at the poisonous fox. There was fear on his face. He had always been like a stone wall around the twins, but only until the moment when the new Li Jinyoung came to him. Li Jinyoung smiled and said that apparently only his beloved and dear friend remained. Li Jinyoung was very serious about dealing with the poisonous fox. Chulmunho quickly realized what was awaiting him in the near future, and also realized that he would not be able to avoid it. The young gentleman clapped his hands, noting that his dear friend deserved it. The poisonous fox exhaled and said that Li Jinyoung should have been told that during his recovery he had not studied arithmetic and martial arts. Jinyoung frowned and pointed out that Chulmunho was usually quick on the uptake and asked why that didn't happen this time. Then Jinyoung's gaze fell on the sharp blade of the knife that Munho held in his hand. Chulmunho prepared to defend himself and holding a knife forward warned no one to approach him and suggested that they just talk. He understood that he shouldn't be afraid. Well, his whole body was shaking with fear. While he tried to convince himself that Jinyoung was a complete weakling and deciding that he could defeat him with the first blow, he rushed into the attack. But what was his surprise when instead of his opponent running into the table, he suddenly appeared right in front of him. Jinyoung instantly turned the table over so that the poisonous fox flew away from him. Then the young gentleman decided to use his skills and show Chulmunho something he had never even guessed about. Following the table, the poisonous Liza received a punch from a fist. After this, the young gentleman grabbed the two-headed fox by the hair and noted that he had won the counterattack. Jinyoung smiled right into his eyes before hitting him again. He used a lightning skill and hit Chulmunho with it. He screamed and twitched, taking heavy damage. The guard who had been behind the doors the whole time hid in the corner and thought that if things continued like this, someone would definitely die. Chulmunho, despite the severe damage he had received, still continued to hold on, although he already doubted that he would be able to resist his supposed friend. Jinyoung beat up his good friend enough and threw him to the floor. Chulmunho was no longer able to stand on his feet and fell next to his twin bodyguards. Jinyoung sat down next to him and demanded that he pull himself together, but he could only groan in response. Having gathered all his strength, Chulmunho began to try to rise, firmly clinging to the floor with his fingers and trying to push off from it. He was breathing heavily, but he could tell that he was still there and ready to fight on. He thought to himself and still couldn't understand what Li Jinyoung was doing during his recovery and how he gained such strength. He even suggested that the young master was not undergoing treatment but was secretly training. It was strange that the young master did all this just for the sake of revenge, and it seemed like everyone hadn't treated him that badly. But Chulmunho was convinced that Jinyoung was always trying to take revenge on him, even though he seemed to have caused him some harm. Chulmunho jumped to his feet and offered him to take something else besides the key, promising to definitely fulfill this request. Chulmunho noted that of course he hit him a couple of times, but still they had been friends since childhood and were like family. He tried to convince the young master that they were not enemies just to save his own life. He insisted that it was true friendship and not hitting him was the right decision. Chulmunho even rushed to hug Jinyoung, saying that from now on there would be no fights or mockery between them, but Jinyoung demanded that he leave him alone because of the nausea he caused. Chulmunho continued to talk about how they were best friends, but at some point he changed his mind and called them brothers. By this time, the twins had come to their senses, and the poisonous fox demanded that they greet their new older brother and show respect and congratulate him on his transformation. This circus only amused Li Jinyoung. He understood perfectly well what the poisonous fox was trying to achieve, and also understood that he had managed to catch them on the hook after all. This guy humiliated himself, licked his boots, and wagged his tail at his every word. Jinyoung knew that all he had to do was wait to get out of this place, grab the twins, and get away. He knew that if the twins were with him, then finding a new hangout would not be a problem for him. and after these thoughts he turned to Manhwa and Jinbo. He warned that when he called someone brother he swears to do so for the rest of his life and asked them if they were really ready for this. The twins liked each other and then looked at the poisonous fox who was outraged by such a look and promised that they all swear to be brothers from that moment on. The twins hearing this also swore to be brothers to Jayan and to no longer have any claims against him. Chulmunho praised them for their attitude and Jayan noted that everything was fine now. After that he suggested that since they were all brothers now it was worth deciding which of them was the eldest. He asked the twins to go outside the door so that they could decide everything between themselves and the poisonous fox. And then he told them about it. Chulmunho did not want to be left alone with this man, especially without his bodyguards who would not even have time to react if something happened. He asked to stop Jinyoung and prevent him from driving the twins out of his room. Well, the twins have already walked away. I draw attention to the agitated look of their true master. Soon Chulmunho and Jinyoung were left alone. They stood opposite each other and were silent for a while. Still Jinyoung asked the poisonous fox what he was doing. I hope to find out what he was planning here without any extra effort. He asked that it be worthwhile to resolve everything as quickly as possible, thinking that it was all about money. He noted that Muncho made a good profit from these gullible guys, although he shouldn't have behaved like that. Jinyoung declared that from that moment on he would take care of them and smiled widely. The poisonous fox smiled rather than actually chuckled. He lowered his gaze and suggested that Jinyoung just take the money he originally wanted. He covered his face with his hands, noting that first Jinyoung had beaten him and now he wanted to take the twins too. He screamed that this could mean that it was time to die and asked to kill him as soon as possible and not make him suffer so much. Jinyoung rolled his eyes, outraged by his adopted brother's conclusion, but he immediately agreed with him and dealt him a strong blow to the head. Jinyoung came to this place to kill the poisonous fox and had no intention of leaving it alive. Finally, Jinyoung noted that the poisonous fox had worked hard, but now it was time for him to rest. Afterwards, he struck Munho with a blow and several more blows to different points on the body. It was too late for Chulmunho to think that Jinyoung had actually decided to kill him. Receiving blow after blow, he became more and more convinced of this. But he had nowhere to go and he understood that now he would really die. He tried to somehow fix the situation. I still hope that he will be able to beg for his life back. He began to wheeze and promised to give him everything, but because of the pain they still couldn't finish the sentence. Jinyoung hit him again and rolled his eyes, noting that he hadn't heard anything, and finally the poisonous leaf screamed that it would give him the key and began to beg for mercy. Jinyoung smiled and wondered out loud that people didn't seem to be begging for mercy in exactly that way. Chulmunho was already very tired of everything that was happening and cursing asked if he should have spoken more respectfully, since they were friends. After these words, the poisonous leaf did not feel any more blows but surprisingly felt the wind that blew over its entire body. Jinyoung grabbed him again and threw him to the other end of the hall they were in. Jinyoung threw the poisonous fox, broke through the entrance doors and threw it into the corridor where the twins and the guard were. Jinyoung was very surprised how Chulmunho was able to smile bravely until the very end while being in such a position. Looking at the beaten Chulmunho, who tried to pretend to be someone unknown, until the very end, Jinyoung decided that he was most likely completely out of his mind. The twins leaned over their master and one by one began to ask if he really lost to Jinyoung. Unable to rise, the poison leaf confirmed its defeat and explained that from that moment on Jinyoung was their older brother who was worth serving well. At that moment, the poisonous forest thought only that he had been humiliated very much. He felt disgusting and just wanted to cry loudly. Well, after thinking a bit, I decided that the twins probably should have lived somewhere decent, for example in the Yonha Trading Guild, rather than the crappy gambling spot where they were. The poisonous fox was very sad to say goodbye to his bodyguards because they had been together for so long, and he was even convinced that there was some kind of special connection between them. After saying goodbye, the twins immediately hurried after Jinyoung. They were laconic, which further finished off the poisonous fox. In his mind he sent them far away, called them ungrateful bald fools, and as he climbed the stairs he remembered the words of the old men who said that you should never mess with black-haired people. When he appeared in the tavern, everyone immediately started whispering behind him, calling him a walking corpse. He was so beaten. Many were surprised that he did not have twins who always walked around with him, and assumed that if there were no more twins then everyone had a chance to kill him. Just feeling that Chulmunho was more vulnerable than ever before, obstacles immediately appeared in his path. Seeing that his way was being blocked, he laughed loudly. He understood that he would not be able to avoid this fight and said that all the rats immediately crawled out of the cracks. He was at his limit and shouted that he was a poisonous fox and called on everyone to attack him and not just talk behind his back. Some of those present thought he was too arrogant, considering that he looked like a walking corpse. This really only provoked everyone into a fight, and many rushed at him with knives. Looking at how many people were running towards him, Chulmunho assumed that he really could have been killed now and thought that Jian should have been a little easier on him. Chulmunho was literally saying goodbye to his life, understanding that he would not be able to cope with such a crowd, but suddenly to his surprise everything went wrong. In an instant all the attackers scattered to the sides. Some furniture was shattered into pieces in seconds. Chulmunho heard a voice next to him that said that people previously could not look into Chulmunho's eyes, but now they were attacking him in droves because he had weakened. It was Jian who said this. He warned that if everyone wanted to kill the poisonous fox, they should have fought him when he was not half dead, and called them a bunch of dishonest jackals. The crowd immediately turned their attention to other things and left the poisonous fox alone. This humiliated him even more. He cursed and noted that they were complete freaks, although they behaved like heroes. He staggered towards the exit of this tavern, cursing at the world and the people who lived in it. Jian continued to work on his plan, and now he had two twins as his assistants who possessed enormous strength. When they were taking out some things, they decided to turn to their older brother Jian. They thanked him for helping Muncho and were sincerely worried about him, even though he was not a very decent person. When Jian turned to them after hearing these words, they also bowed to him, repeating their gratitude. Jian didn't respond to this, but he was still pleased that these two retained at least some humanity within themselves. Everyone who has ever been to this den once asked themselves the same question. No one understood why these twins followed Chulmunho. Some said that they were sold here as slaves, while others said that the twins followed him out of fear. Jian himself thought the same thing. He thought that they simply had strong enemies and therefore found a secluded place for themselves. But the twins were not associated with fear, and no one sold them to this disgusting place. Even in his second life, understanding people's true motives was incredibly difficult for Dan Wusen, who had to partly play the role of Li Jian. For himself, he decided that he would observe everything that was happening around him and try to make the most correct conclusions possible. When Jian and the twins were taking out the jewelry from Chulmunho's safe, they were watched from the side. The young man who had been watching them from the darkness could not believe his eyes. He could not admit to himself that he had actually seen Jian. He, like many others, could not recognize him after the changes. After Jian freed the poison fox's safe, he introduced the twins to his men. They were now members of the Yanga Merchant Guild family. The Yonha trading group was still noisy with the arrival of the leader's eldest son. Jayan, the youngest son, was very angry because there had not been a single peaceful day since his older brother returned. He was angry that just the other day his brother suddenly brought a mountain of money and then brought two big guys that he didn't like at all. And in general, the changes did not end in this place. Just walking around my yard, he noticed something else surprising. This made him freeze in place to get the best possible view of everything. A carriage drawn by two horses driven by Mok in Sop entered the estate. There were a lot of filled chests, boxes, and barrels in the cart. When the carriage stopped, Jayan hurried to it and gave Mok and Sip instructions on where to leave the carriage, noting that it was carrying something very important. Jayan immediately hurried to his brother and tried to find out what it all meant because he was completely out of the loop. Looking around, he discovered that the carts were the same 100-year-old elixir for which people had been lining up since dawn. And suddenly a voice was heard behind him which noted that he had ordered all of this. When Jayan turned around, you saw your father, who looked much better, already moving arm in arm with one of his men. Jayan hurried to him, noting that walking was still very difficult for him, and he should return to his chambers, but his father assured him that he was fine and felt much better. Jayan turned to his father and asked what he was going to do with all these elixirs. Jayan remembers that his older brother asked for only one elixir, but in fact much more arrived. And he hoped that at least one would go to him. But his father greatly disappointed him by answering that all the elixirs were intended for his older brother Li Jian. The young man began to be indignant about why my brother needed so many of these elixirs and why he couldn't take at least one. Father replied that one elixir was not enough to change fate, and considering how much they had already spent on the Ouyang clan and all those of the minor deity, this amount was very small. The father said that he sent letters to the heads of their branches, his old friends and respected large traders. He said that they were urgently purchasing high-quality elixirs to overcome the crisis threatening their trading group. The father smiled, noting that if they failed, they would also suffer losses. So everyone took it seriously, and since it was his idea to appoint Ouyang Hu as the squad captain, he had to take full responsibility, at least in this way. Han Yip, who was a support for the group leader, noted that this was a wise decision and the first young master would definitely become a great martial artist, which the leader completely agreed with. He thanked the deputy head of security, expressing that he really appreciated his support, and he replied that he could be counted on at any moment. Jayan didn't even have time to get a word in. He was outraged, but his father insisted that this was a wonderful, simply ideal opportunity. He said that it was finally time for them to spend their earnings and looked very pleased. Jayan couldn't find the words to answer his father or to somehow object to what was happening. At first he wanted to refrain from any conflicts, but he still couldn't hold back. He shouted loudly and demanded that everyone stop and listen to him. He demanded that his father explain where his elixir was and why everyone had forgotten about it. This statement surprised the leader of the group. He did not expect that his youngest son would also demand some kind of elixir. He doubted that his son needed such an elixir at all. This finally angered the youngest son, and he began to run around the yard and destroy everything in his path out of anger. Wherever he went, he heard only the name of his older brother, but he got nothing. It seemed to him that everyone was oppressing him. He cursed his older brother and did not understand what kind of miracle this brat had stumbled upon. Suddenly Jayan heard a sound that was unfamiliar to him and stopped to listen for a moment. The noise was coming from behind him. When he turned around, he saw a young man who was running as fast as lightning. He didn't recognize his older brother right away. Only when he shouted that he was out for a walk and everyone had to make way, he rushed past him and knocked him down. When Jayan turned around to look at him, he discovered that he was covered in various weights. Jayan didn't understand at all what kind of walk it would be like with a huge boulder on his back. His brother dragged him along. Even Jin Yong's feet were weighted. They were wrapped around his ankles. Jin Yong was extremely focused on running and strictly followed the techniques. Jayan looked after my brother with only envy and some malice that was beginning to hide within him. He called him a lucky guy who finally decided to put in the effort. He could only explain it this way. After thinking about her for a long time, he lay down on the ground and spread his arms and legs to the sides. He lay down for a while, raised his sword, and looked at his reflection. He carefully examined his face, which was reflected in the polished metal of his sword. Jayan decided to devote the rest of the time until the evening to training. He went to the training ground and began to practice fighting with the ball. He did this by imagining various scenes. He even imagined himself in the role of his older brother who had defeated the captain of the guard. He tried to distract himself, but each time he was overtaken by different memories that only became more and more depressing. Once again, he remembered his older brother Jin Yong's battle. He remembered how he moved and what he said. He remembered his strongest blows precisely to weak points that knocked out his opponents. She remembered how strong her brother was. He was so powerful that he could lift a person with one hand and throw him like a stone. This made Jayan very jealous because it was precisely through fights like these that his brother earned so much attention in a very short time. He continued to curse his brother without understanding him at all and calling him all sorts of abusive words. He was careless enough to curse at him out loud and didn't even notice how Jin Yong himself appeared right next to him, thereby frightening him. Jayan cursed openly and asked why he had suddenly appeared near him, since he wanted to take a walk. Someone explained that he had already returned and advised his younger brother to practice the movement properly. He picked up his sword and held it out to him, asking him to show him what he had learned, noting that his repetition of Ouyang Hu's techniques was quite good. Jayan was indignant that his older brother was also secretly watching him, but he still decided not to argue and stood up to show everything he could. He took the sword and stood firmly on his feet opposite his brother. He gripped his sword tighter and rushed forward to attack. He used a stabbing blow, the future convinced that he does everything perfectly. But Jin Yong commented that this thrust was as careless as his master's. This comment didn't please Jayan very much, and he got angry again. He attacked his brother again and started cursing at him and his sharp tongue. He attacked Jin Yen, then very quickly dodged and managed to fight back his younger younger brother showing incredibly high skill. In addition, Jin Yong continued to comment on his brother's skills, telling what mistakes Ouyang Hu whose strikes he trained made. Jayan didn't even have time to come to her senses before Jin Yun attacked him. Even though it was training in a real fight, he would have lost very quickly if he had taken such a blow. Jin Yong said that after Ouyang Hu's distraction by closing the distance failed, all he could do was try to defend himself. Trying to defend himself against his own brother Jayan didn't understand what was wrong with this psycho. I understand that I haven't learned anything yet. Jayan put his hands forward and asked his brother to stop and just talk to him. But Jayan found out that Jin Yun wasn't even listening to him and decided to continue this fight. Let's decide what will be will be. He grabbed his sword and rushed to attack Jin Yun, gathering all his strength and spirit. Well, when it seemed like it was time to strike, Jayan discovered that the target had disappeared. Looking around, he couldn't see his older brother anywhere. He had the feeling that he had simply disappeared right under his nose. He didn't have time to get his bearings before Jin Yong attacked him from behind, taking advantage of the fact that his younger brother was very confused. He said that when people lost their advantage and found themselves backed into a corner, they always pulled out their best hidden trump card. Jayan was scared again, not expecting any blows behind him, and again did not have time to orient himself to block the blow. Jin Yong entered this instructive fight not to somehow rise in the eyes of his brother, but only to teach him. They trained until the sun began to set behind the mountains. It was clear on the training ground that some kind of fight was going on because all the exercise equipment was scattered around. Jayan was unable to stand up to his own brother and suffered several defeats. Jin Yong didn't hit him with full force, and that was enough for Jayan to feel and fully experience his own mistakes. Jayan fell to the ground and began to back away from his brother, trying to show that he didn't want to continue any longer. He was incredibly scared. I understand that it almost killed him. Jin Yong said that piercing blows had a lower probability of hitting than slashing. He also added that the three-form sword art, the first form of which Ouyang Hu tried to use, should be used with extreme caution. He brought the sword closer to Jayan's head. Jin Yun explained that if he doesn't act faster in this short moment, then the outcome of the battle will be decided, trying to explain to his brother how to behave on the battlefield. After explaining everything properly, Jin Yong thought that if he were like his younger brother, but in his past life someone like Ouyang Hu wouldn't even have time to pull out a sword. However, now his body was not even a quarter of what it was when he was the king of fists. That's why Ouyang Hu was not someone to be proud of defeating. However, there were people whom he, even as the king of fists, could not surpass. He was a very great man in his past life. It didn't mean he was invincible. Many were more cunning than him and had greater agility than him, which allowed them to outmaneuver him in a difficult fight. After training with my brother, we explained some basics to him. He thought about his own and decided that this could not continue any longer. He decided that he needed to become even stronger. He wanted to be much stronger than he was before. One of the maids approached him and informed him that a guest was waiting for the young master. He thanked the girl and promised that he would come soon. Jayan noticed that as soon as the maid reported the arrival of the guest, his older brother's face suddenly became so serious. Before leaving, Lee Jin-young flicked Jayan's face and he let out a thin squeal in surprise at the pain. Jayan became indignant and asked why Jin-yun hit him, to which he replied that he hit him because he was a damn bastard, as he had called him before. There were many voices coming from the estate. It felt like there was some serious argument going on there. Several people argued that Jin-young couldn't know martial arts because the guy who only did what he did was run after girls couldn't suddenly practice martial arts. Gu from the Yun family shouted that he wouldn't believe it because he saw it all with his own eyes. He said that when he got drunk the other day, he was passing by Chulmunho's mountain house and was delighted with the luxurious flooring that he came across. Just then he came across Jin Yong and the twins, who were loading boxes into a cart, and the voice seemed very familiar to him, although he did not immediately recognize the gentleman. He himself could not believe his own eyes because the last time he saw him the young gentleman looked completely different. He even stopped to take a closer look and make sure his eyes weren't lying. He added that at that moment he vomited, but as soon as he turned around after that, the young gentleman was gone. Another man emphasized that this is precisely why no one believes him. Sema Guuwok smiled and asked to stop this argument, noting that they came for one important matter. They entered the hall where the young gentleman was to see if he was still the same. When the gentleman came to visit, he was just training and was without outerwear. Even from the state of his muscles, one could tell that he had changed a lot. Jin Yong was not very happy to be disturbed so suddenly and grimaced when he saw his guests. The guests froze right at the door, not believing what their eyes were seeing. Without even greeting the young gentleman, the guests immediately closed the doors and did not dare to enter inside. Sema Guuwok demanded that her friends explain whether they were sure that the head of the trading group had not adopted a new child, but the maid assured that it was indeed their young master. Everyone decided that they had had too much to drink the night before and it was all a hallucination. They couldn't believe that it was all true. They remembered the very sick skinny Lee Jin-yong, and now they saw before them a large muscular strong young man expressing incredible confidence. Lee Jin-yun became very curious about who had come to see him, and unable to restrain himself, he got dressed and looked out into the corridor. He turned to Mu-yang and asked her to take the twins and take them to the common dining room, emphasizing that they had eaten a lot and should have been given larger plates. The girl bowed her head and invited the twins to follow her. The guests wanted to take advantage of the opportunity and quickly run away, but they did not have time. Yes, in order to feed the twins properly, the young gentleman turned to his guests. He asked why they were still standing in the corridor and did not want to come to him in peace. They only wanted to test their guesses, but when they met the young gentleman, they completely changed their minds about having any conversations with him, having experienced fear. The self-proclaimed 4 heavenly kings of wine and women hoping to join the Murim alliance. One of them was Sema Guuwok. Suffering from irritable bowel syndrome and constantly retaking exams was Jayan, the representative of the West Wind Security Agency, and the youngest heir of his house was named Gu-yun. The infamous heir to the Yona trading group Lee Jin-young was the 4th. They all gathered after hearing the incredible rumor that their friendly loser friend had returned. They decided to have a snack together first and then start talking. Jin-yong wasn't very happy to see his self-proclaimed friends again. He couldn't stand them. Lee Jin-young remembered seeing these guys before, as they were always hanging out and chatting about drinking and women. He thought that before they called themselves something like the 4 drunk idiots or maybe the 4 slackers. Well, Lee Jin-young was completely different now. Jayan noted that they came because they heard that their friend had returned and asked if everything was okay, to which Jin-young assured that everything was fine with him. Jayan smiled, noting that he looked even better than normal and had a very stern look. Gu-yun grabbed Jin-young's hand and looking at it said that he couldn't believe that the one he saw then was really his friend, and apparently the secret had been training non-stop. Sema Guuwok understood that such a level could not be achieved through training alone and that something else was involved. He carefully studied his friend, looking him over from head to toe. He assumed that his friend now possessed martial arts and did not even doubt it. He said that there were rumors about Ouyang Hu's victory and asked who taught him martial arts, since it was impossible to learn something like that on your own, to which Jin-yong emphasized that he was just lucky. Sema Guuwok smiled, noting that this meant that it was one of those fateful meetings in Yenhu that one could only hear about, and Jayan added that at first he didn't even recognize his friend. Lee Jin-young took a sip and noted that the guy was dead. His friends stared at him in complete bewilderment. Jayan asked what to do now and if Lee Jin-young had any plans. Lee Jin-young wanted to talk about the demonic faction but immediately interrupted himself by saying that he had debts that needed to be repaid, and now he would help in the guild and prepare. He shared that now he was not interested in anything except becoming stronger and stronger. This made his friends fall into silence again. They looked at each other, not understanding what was happening to their friend. Gu-yun guessed that they might have gotten to the wrong house and that this guy just looked a lot like someone they knew. After dinner, Sema Guuwok approached Lee Jin-young and asked if he would be going somewhere to recover. Lee Jin-young said that it was almost a reference and his father must have been very disappointed. Sema Guuwok smiled and noted that it could be for the best and advised using this time to recover and learn to change. Lee Jin-young smiled and looked down at the floor, promising that he would work on it. He said that it would be great, and if everything worked out that way he would be happy, and the guys laughed. Sema Guuwok poured the drink into the glass and once again congratulated Lee Jin-young on the fact that he had really changed. One could even say that Sema Guuwok was truly sincerely happy for his friend. Lee Jin-young looked at him and at the glass he had filled, expecting something else to be said. Jayan and Gu-yun also remained silent. Look at your friend. But still Jayan decided to break this awkward silence and noted that it was worth celebrating, and Gu-yun said that he knew it and said that they should have kidnapped that idiot before he was sent away. Sema Guuwok smiled, noting that his friend hadn't even come that day because he was suffering from a hangover, and Guyun snorted and corrected him that he was simply busy. Sema Guuwok continued to laugh at him, coming up with various jokes, and he was very indignant and tried to get out of the awkward situation. Dan Wusen listened to all this thought. It turns out that even Jayan, whose body he ended up in, had real friends, a comparison with his past and present life. Lee Jin-young bought some drinks for her friends and asked for some attention. He raised his glass and, having said that he had changed, asked what had happened to them. They all froze and stared at him with the same bewilderment. Ju Jayoung smiled and asked what he meant by generalizing them all, and explained that if they were the ones who changed easily, they would no longer be themselves. Lee Jin-young, clinking glasses with his friends, suggested that they just stop talking about it, and everyone laughed together. Ju Jayoung Pil very slowly thought about what he and his friends had assumed before meeting Lee Jin-young. They thought they were frogs in a well, but it turned out that everything was completely different. He analyzed everything that happened to them all and paid the most attention to their friend Lee Jin-young. They were still friendly and had a lot in common. They understood each other's jokes and trusted each other a lot. They had a great time together even after such a long separation. But only one of them had already managed to get out and see the whole world. The rest remained the same. Before saying goodbye, the friends told Lee Jin-young that if he needed anything from those slackers, he just had to say so. Lee Jin-young was wished strength to train harder so as not to get into trouble somewhere, and was once again congratulated on his transformation. Lee Jin-young completed their turn and waved goodbye. He remained standing in the same place until his friends disappeared from sight. His whole company also waved their hands and whistled until they disappeared around the corner. They had much food for thought after this great meeting with their beloved friend. Guyun looked at the stars and said that of all of them, it was the most hopeless one who returned as an adult. He felt as if his youth was over. Sema Guuwok supported him, noting that it was a particularly sad day, and asked them to hurry. Ju Jayoung asked where they were going, thinking that it might be a brothel. Sema Guuwok yelled at him, reminding him that he had failed his exams and had been expelled from the academy, and that he should now go home and study. Guyun interrupted him and suggested that they go to the House of Sweet Scents for a drink. Everyone liked this idea, and the whole group went to the House of Sweet Aromas to have some more drinks. At the same time, in the House of Sweet Aromas, one of the servants brought news to his master. The gentleman heard this news and was beside himself with rage and began to pound the table with his fist. It was the leader of the minor deity sect named Yom Jiang. He was very upset that Ouyang Hu was dead. He couldn't believe that the heir of the Yonha trading group was really that strong, and his man confirmed it, saying that he had knocked out the captain in less than 30 blows. The guard who reported this to his master was personally present there and saw everything with his own eyes. He was one of the first to rush to his aid, although it was already too late to do anything. It was he who lifted his master in his arms and showered curses on the first young master. For him, this loss was worse than for anyone else, and he wanted revenge. Although the first young master had instilled some fear in his heart at that time, it only increased his desire to shower that person with curses. This warrior admitted that the first young master was incredibly skilled, and that was why he was able to defeat Ouyang Hu. Yom Jiang said that it was impressive and asked what kind of weapon the first young master fought with, and the fighter said that he used his fists. Yom Jiang thought it was a shame that the swordsman lost to a young fighter who fought only with his fists. The fighter asked if there would be revenge on the first young master for taking the life of the great Ouyang Hu. But Yom Jiang was outraged how they could take revenge for a fair and open fight, and emphasized that they were not bandits. The fighter prayed that the first young master deserved to receive punishment for what he had done, ignoring the fact that Ouyang himself had accepted this duel. He reminded Yom Jiang that he and Ouyang Hu were friends, and did not understand how such a tragedy did not touch his heart at all. The fighter shouted that there was honor between them. He was mad with anger, but soon all his emotions disappeared. Yom Jiang wasn't going to tolerate such whining and chopped off the fighter's head without even blinking an eye. Blood splashed onto the maids who were standing nearby. Many were frightened and screamed. Yom Jiang, having finished with this fighter, was outraged that someone else could still talk about some kind of friendship with a corpse. He ordered one of his men to remove the body as quickly as possible, so that it would not spoil his mood. The maid next to him was shaking with fear. You didn't even have to look closely to see how scared she was. Yom Jiang hugged her and apologized for letting the girl see this. Looking at the blood stain on his floor, Yom Jiang said that now even the drink was not going well and they had to go back. When the servants approached him to conduct the meeting, he summed up that the Yanga trading group refused to pay the tax and they killed Ouyang Hu. One of his men asked how they should react to this. He pointed out that this also meant that they did not even recognize all those minor deities. Yom Jiang responded that this was exactly what he thought. Another of the people asked the leader if he was going to kill them, but this only angered him. He emphasized that they could not just go around killing people since they were not some kind of bandits. One of the warriors was surprised that the leader apparently just wanted to let them go, and he thought about it. Li Jinyoung's friends continued to discuss their meeting. Their dear friend had changed and they were still marking time, and they felt completely hopeless. By this time, the leader of the minor deities and his people came out of the closed hall. Just as the leader was saying that he wanted to get the money from the Yona trading group, Sema Guuwok passed by him. By chance, he happened to hear everything that was said by the leader at that moment. These words immediately caught Sema Guuwok's attention, and he turned around to see who was talking. Yom Jiang continued to talk about Li Sungmin, who was a master negotiator, and was rumored to be much richer than he appeared. Yom Jiang was very interested in how much the heir to such a trading group would be worth. He was planning something very bad. Sema Guuwok listened carefully to these phrases and immediately understood what was being discussed. Immediately after hearing this conversation, Sema Guuwok ran back to Li Jinyoung, who luckily opened the door for him. Seeing Sema Guuwok on his doorstep, he was slightly surprised, and when he heard what he was talking about, he didn't take his words seriously at first. He said sarcastically that it was so touching that it brought tears to his eyes, especially considering that his friend had arrived so late. But Sema Guuwok almost screamed that those people looked like they were about to attack. Sema Guuwok began to think about what to do since Ouyang Hu was dead, and there was not even a proper guard at Li Jinyoung's house. He wondered if he should ask Guyun for help. Li Jinyoung began to think about what his friend had said. He recalled some information about the minor deity sect. He thought that these were the same ones that Ma Kinsip was talking about. According to him, this was the sect that wanted to betray him and Ouyang Hu. Li Jinyoung asked his friend where the people who were talking about the attack were at the moment, and he assumed that they were probably already at home. Li Jinyoung dragged Sema Guuwok to his home, although he began to resist out of surprise. He handed him the clothes and asked him to put them on. Sema Guuwok was slightly displeased. He tried to get an explanation of what it was and where they were, and Li Jinyoung explained that they were in the security warehouse. Jinyoung asked if Sema Guuwok knew where the sect of minor deities was located, so he could take him there, and asked him to get dressed quickly because they had to be back in time for breakfast. Sema Guuwok wanted to be indignant because he didn't really believe that they should have gone to the base of this sect together. He noted that Jinyoung didn't even know what they could have been doing there. Jinyoung noted that it didn't matter and therefore they had to act first. Didn't quite understand his friend. He thought it was too stupid to poke his nose into the lair of those who wanted to kill you. Li Jinyoung put a bandage on his face to emphasize that Sema Guuwok was a candidate to join the Murim alliance. He looked at him and asked him to bring them to the base of the minor deities. Sema Guuwok had no choice but to agree with his friend and trust him. In the courtyard of the sect of minor deities there grew a beautiful sakura tree by which one could recognize this place. Very quickly, Li Jinyoung and Sema Guuwok reached the base of the minor deity sect. There were a lot of security guards around the area, and it was necessary to behave as carefully as possible in order not to be seen unnecessarily. But also the presence of such a large number of guards also gave them the assurance that they had come to the right place. Sema Guuwok, as soon as they entered the base, he asked if his friend knew that he could not count on any help in battle. Li Jinyoung shook the dust off her hands, and I looked around and replied that Sema Guuwok's work was finished, and he had no further claims. Sema Guuwok was surprised that Jinyoung just wanted to be taken to the place to which he asked what he really thought. But Sema Guuwok didn't really have time to think about anything because everything happened too quickly. Looking around, he asked if Li Jinyoung had some kind of brilliant plan because there were a lot of guards inside and it was unclear how anyone could get in there. Jinyoung thought for a moment, and after that he suddenly ran forward, not fearing but on the contrary wanting to be noticed. Sema Guuwok looked at his friend with horror, realizing that they had ended up in real hell. Jinyoung on the contrary was very calm and suggested his friend to remember the past. Dan Wusen has never backed down or avoided a fight since she was a child. When he was an orphan in an orphanage, he did not allow himself to be offended and defended his honor to the end. When he wandered around Jianghu, he did not retreat when he encountered strong enemies even when he was in a serious condition. He did not retreat even when his strength helped him take the throne of the King of Fists and it seemed that there was nowhere else to strive. He always fought with anyone who wished him harm or offended others. He made everyone respect his name no matter what it cost him. Whoever he met, they knew who was in front of them and knew that it was not worth it to cross this person's path or argue with him in any way. No matter where he was, Dan Wusong was always a man who enjoyed fighting. Li Jinyun Gordon passed through all the guards of the minor deity sect and made them bewildered by such impudence. He asked one of the guards where he could find their leader, but the guard was angered by this behavior and he said that Jin Yong was a crazy fool who burst in and talked nonsense. Jin Yong took this guard with one hand and lifted him high above the ground and warned that it was better not to force him to repeat it. After that, he threw the guard onto the stone floor that covered the entire base. That fall killed the guard. This provoked aggression from other people from the base, and they all rushed at Jin Yong shouting that he didn't understand where he was coming from. At that moment, a man appeared on the balcony of the building and demanded to know why it was so noisy outside. It was the sect leader Yom Jiang. He had one arm around the girl and asked who the guest was. Jin Yong introduced himself as the killer and asked if the man was the leader of the lesser deity sect. Yom Jiang wondered what happened if it was true. He had never seen a killer enter through the front door and was very curious about the guy standing in front of him. He turned his attention to the hands of this killer. He had the impression that he had seen them somewhere or heard about them. He remembered his conversation with the fighter who told him about the man who killed Ouyang Hu and fought only with his fists. After thinking for a while, Yom Jiang asked the killer if he was by any chance the young master of the Yona Trade Guild, and Jin Yun asked what happened if that was true. The head of the sect said that he never expected that a person of his status would come to him personally. Yom Jiang said that in that case he would not hold back and would take full advantage of it. Yom Jiang accepted the challenge and decided to enter into battle to test the strength of this gentleman who had spread many rumors and cast a net on him. The chieftain ordered his men to seize the uninvited guest. They immediately began to carry out this order. Jin Yun thought about how long it had been since he had fought several opponents at once. This fight was already bringing him pleasure. He could hardly remember the last time something like this had happened. Jin Yong grabbed the net, preventing it from entangling him. He somersaulted in the air and threw the safe in the other direction, grabbing the sect leader's men in it. He thought about the fact that his body seemed to be not at the same level as in his past life. But nevertheless he had a great advantage over his opponents. And even this fight he perceived as pure entertainment and received a lot of pleasure. He chopped down his opponents one by one, and they didn't even have time to realize what was happening. Very quickly the base of the minor deity sect turned into a place of bloody massacre. Blood was spraying in all directions. There were corpses of the sectarian guards everywhere. Soon the guards realized that the uninvited guest fought incredibly hard even without a weapon. This instilled fear in them, and they did not want to give up their lives even without a chance to win. Soon Jin Yong dealt with most of his opponents. He looked like a real monster who destroyed everything in his path and nothing could stop him. But the head of the sect Yom Jiang managed to try his luck and threw an arrow at the master. The arrow passed tangentially but managed to tear the mask that covered Jin Yong's face. The shooter also left a deep cut on his cheek. Jin Yong wiped the blood from his face and turned to the man and asked if he was just bragging about his weapon. The head of the sect Yom Jiang replied that he did not want to use it because it was very expensive. Well, he added that since Jin Yong was such a respected guest, an exception was made for him, and raised his crossbow to make another shot. Meanwhile, the other people of the sect leader had already rushed at the young master and were holding him tightly by the legs, not allowing him to move from the spot. The leader shouted at them, asking them to hold him as tightly as possible. One of the fighters holding the master thought that if everything went like this, he really could die here. Yom Jiang was sure that even with the level of skill that the young master possessed, it would be very difficult to dodge something like that. A dozen more warriors appeared next to him who were also armed with crossbows and were aiming directly at the master. The head of the sect gave the command and every single fighter fired their arrows. But Jin Yong was only amused by this. He thought this was a stupid act because even the leader's own disciples could be attacked, and even in the underworld such a thing would be disgusting. At that moment someone called out to him, although he thought he was alone. The man threw a sword at him. One of the sect leader's disciples wanted to intercept it, but he didn't have time. Jin Yong successfully obtained the blade and gripped it tightly in his hands. The next moment, thanks to just one turn, he was able to get rid of everyone who was holding his legs tightly, not allowing him to move from the spot. He was a little upset by what was happening. And after such a vile act with his disciples, he was even more angry with the head of the sect of minor deities. Sect leader Yom Jiang watched the young master and was amazed that he was able to repel the steel spikes with an ordinary dagger. The one who gave Jin Yun the dagger was Sema Guuwok, who never left the base and stayed behind to be able to somehow help his friend. Jin Yong, noticing him, smiled and waved his hand, showing with a gesture that he did everything correctly. Sema Guuwok smiled back at him even though it was hidden under his mask and returned the gesture in kind. Jin Yong began to slowly walk forward, approaching the building where the leader was hiding and twirling a dagger in his palm. After walking a short distance, the young gentleman started running. He was like lightning and killed several more of the headman's disciples. He threw a dagger straight at Yom Jiang. The dagger passed near the neck and made a very deep cut on it. The leader's blood gushed in all directions. Yom Jiang grabbed his neck and bent over, unable to contain his groans and wheezes. Jin Yong said that he usually didn't use the sword and only fought with his fists, and he added that this time, for the sake of such an important person, he could make an exception. Yom Jiang looked at her opponent and considered him an abnormal bastard, and he had absolutely no other words. He yelled at his men for just standing there and gave the order to shoot and kill the man. Meanwhile, Jin Yong continued to calmly approach the building and continue his conversation with the sect head. After walking some distance again, Jin Yong rushed forward and later made several dashes. Literally a few seconds later, he was right next to Yom Jiang. Before his blow, he said that he specialized in fist fighting. But the head of Yom Jiang reacted very quickly and placed the girl right in front of him, believing that the killer would not be able to harm her. It was a very cowardly act. Only cowards did that. Jin Yong was shocked that such a respected person could do such a thing. He had no option to jump aside and not strike. That is why the attack took place. It was a very powerful blow that destroyed some parts of the balcony on which the leader of the sect stood. The birds flew away in different directions upon hearing such a terrible sound. Dust and sawdust from the broken tree rose into the air. Jin Yong didn't hurt the girl and managed to intercept her before he could hit Yom Jiang. He pressed her to himself and tried to calm the trembling in her body. The girl herself did not expect that she would survive. She was shocked that the young gentleman was able to save her and leave her unharmed. Jin Yong let go of the girl and asked her to move as far away as possible. That time Jin Yong couldn't do any harm to the sect leader because it was in his interests to save the girl. But after seeing this, Yom Jiang began to shake with fear. He began to back away. He crawled on the floor, trying to escape from the killer who had come for his life. He could not even imagine who this young man was. He looked at the young master and thought that if this was true and the young master of the Yongo Trade Guild stood before him, then he had to be an ordinary youth. But this man's fighting style was completely different from that of a newbie. He fought like a seasoned veteran. Jin Yong walked close enough to the sect leader and asked why he was staring at him like that, assuming he had something to say. Yom Jiang begged the young master for mercy, complaining that he had saved up a lot of money. Yom Jiang promised that if the young master spared him, he would pay generously for his life and would spare no expense in doing so. But Jin Yong was not at all interested in the finances of the minor deity sect. Without thinking, he dealt another blow to Yom Jiang. The leader was still conscious, and Jin Yong asked why he was converting human life into money. Before another blow, Jin Yong said that he didn't need it and the boss could keep the money for himself. After these words, Jin Yong dealt another blow to the sect and then grabbed him by the hair. The girl, who was a servant to the head of the sect, watched in horror what was happening, covering her throat with the sleeve of her dress. By that time, Sema Guuwok remained below and was unable to observe this magnificent battle, although he did not hide his admiration for the small part that he could see. Yom Jiang was finished, as evidenced by the huge hole in his chest. Jin Yong simply failed to calculate his strength and felt disgusted when he punched the sect leader in the chest. Sema Guuwok missed all the most interesting things because he was afraid to follow his friend and saw only the smoke that came from the top floor of the building in which the leader was hiding.